Can I please thank Jean-Dominique Mercier, whom, as you know, writes every day on military topics and who just spent a very challenging weekend and a challenging day. Since you are here, and thank you for being here. Before this round table, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to explain to us what happened over the weekend. I mean, I could not make heads understand what happened over the weekend. Do you mean what happened in my life or in the current news? Well, in the current news, you know. Well, all of this was rather related in any way. Good afternoon to you all. So you all know what happened over the weekend. Perhaps some of you followed this up close and read the opinion newspaper this morning. What can I tell you about this? First of all, something important happened. That would be number one. This isn't something that happens so often. You know what happened this weekend. And it showed us what undoubtedly reality was in Russia in terms of its regime. I think that many people were completely mistaken with regards to what Russia was, in considering that Russia was, Putin's Russia was just some kind of reincarnation of the Soviet Union, where the communist ideology was replaced by a liberal ideology, but this is completely mistaken. This regime is a feudal regime where a money sharing well, maybe there are a few Russian trolls. Whenever I, say that word money, something is happening with those Russian trolls. All right, so Russian trolls, you're very welcome to this event. If I were to perhaps convey a message, that would be it. It truly revealed the nature of the regime. In which country in the world can you imagine that a private army, the very fact that a private army exists goes to show that this is not a normal state. You do not have private armed forces. You might have military private companies that provide logistics or support, but not actual private armed forces recruiting in prisons and jails and going at war every day. So the very fact that this Wagner company exists goes to show that we have entered a new regime which probably is more similar to 16th century Italy or Germany during the 30-year war. From a military standpoint, that seems to be much more close to reality. And there was a huge divide in the regime that was completely revealed by the events of the weekend. Obviously, clearly, they're not winning the war in Ukraine. And this weekend was somewhat of an earthquake. There was a shock, and these fault lines will appeared, and they will appear again in the future. And so we have entered an era which is completely uncertain, complete uncertain times. As probably most of you, I was very surprised by the absolutely crazy decision to invade Ukraine. And all of this is ongoing. And now, and then there was the dam a couple of weeks ago, which was destroyed, and Prigozhin's coup de force this weekend. What will happen in the next 2 weeks? It's anyone's guess. Without entering into too much detail, with regards to what's happened. I mean, I'm sure that you know pretty much just as much as I do on the matter. So perhaps we can have a few questions and answers on this. But, I did not come to speak about this. I am here to moderate our next panel discussion. And I wanted to apologize on behalf of Samuel Burlac, who is unable to be with us tonight due to unforeseen events. So here with us are Jean-Luc VUILLEMIN, if you can raise your hand. So you are the Executive VP of the International Network of Orange, and Jean-Hubert LENOTTE, Chief Strategy and Resources Officer at EUTELSAT. Our topic for discussion, for tonight is response to the very scholarly title of Geostrategic and Sovereignty Challenges for Maritime and Space Powers. At the end of our discussion, I believe there will be a Q&A. I mean, we're very pleased to have perhaps 35 minutes ahead of us. So that will be great. So we'll have perhaps a session that will be as interactive as possible. And I'll start by asking our two guests who they are, and most of all, what do they do? What do EUTELSAT and Orange do overall? They do communications. So strategic. Very strategic in nature, but maybe in just a few minutes, since we only have 32 minutes left now. So Jean-Luc, starting with you, followed by Jean-Hubert. Thank you very much, Jean-Dominique. You all know Orange as a national telco operator. Some of you probably use our services on a daily basis. So as a national operator, we collect traffic as generated by our customers, landline, mobile phone services, internet traffic for individuals and companies, and then we take all of that traffic to its destination, final destination. But a lot of that traffic does not stay within France. 80% of traffic is generated by Orange customers towards an international destination. And to reach out to these international destinations, you need specific means and resources. And by intercontinental links, we need to have subsea cables, which account for 99% of intercontinental exchanges today. And for the remaining 1%, we have satellite resources, traditional resources, such as geostationary satellites, or more recently, our new low-orbit constellation services, which are now back in the game, especially when it comes to new sovereignty issues. Okay, so you do subsea cables to transport Orange flows. So generally speaking, from a volume standpoint, we mainly do subsea cables, but satellites, again, are a stream of activity on their own. We cannot place cables everywhere. Especially when it comes to, for example, ships or planes. And also, if there are resilience issues at play, satellites are not sensitive to land disturbances. So in crisis situations, they're particularly important. And in the U.S., as a matter of fact, Walmart, for example, is installing satellite liaisons across their points of sales to ensure service continuity. But at Orange Network, how far do you go? You do not own satellites, but do you own the cables? Do you lay them at the bottom of the ocean with your own ships? To what extent are you operators of all this? Well, we are the operators, but the situation is really different between cables and satellites. In both cases, we can finance systems. That's the main thing that we do. We decide to invest in a system, which might be a subsea cable system or satellite system, and to use it for specific telco needs. In subsea cables, we have a specificity, which we do not have in satellites. We have our own fleet. So we are in a position to maintain and lay subsea cables, but we do not manufacture satellites and we do not manufacture our cables. Yes, so Alcatel would be doing that for you. Okay, so you have your own ships to lay these cables. Okay. And overall, what's the size of that branch for you? I would say that subsea cables is not a business as such. It is an enabler in our jargon, so something that helps other players. In the years of 2000, some companies thought that they would be becoming extremely rich by installing and laying subsea cables. In fact, they became extremely poor, rather. But if for any given reason you do not have any subsea cables anymore due to technical mishaps, due to resilience problems, sovereignty problems, then obviously you would be in a very delicate situation as a state. So, Jean-Hubert, you specialize in satellites, right, and not subsea cables at all. So what do? EUTELSAT is a huge company, right? Well, EUTELSAT is a very large company in our sector. We are a satellite operator, and I'll anticipate on your next question. What's a satellite operator? Well, mainly we buy satellites to satellite manufacturers, and in France and in Europe, we can count on a number of leaders with Thales and Airbus amongst the two main satellite manufacturers in the world. So we buy satellites from them. We also buy launch services with SpaceX or Ariane, for example, and then we resell our services to different operators for video needs, for example. So EUTELSAT, for the past 40 years, has mainly done has mainly provided satellite TV services. And then we also have connectivity services for all kinds of customers, of course, for individuals. So we have a satellite for which we've been collaborating to a great extent with Orange, and I would like to thank you for that great collaboration. Thanks to that collaboration, we can provide connectivity in areas with no fibers and with a lower connectivity. Small part of the territory, but important nonetheless. There are other companies as well, and as Jean-Luc was saying, that's very important. Mobility services for ships and planes, and also governments. So we provide that connectivity, and as you'll easily understand, that connectivity is important. Usually, we're not in direct touch with the final customer. And for the maritime sector, we'll go through service providers, so people such as Marlink, KVH, or others who will be in charge of installing and maintaining all the facilities and installations. So we provide connectivity, and then they'll do the rest. And also, if I may mention now, EUTELSAT is currently acquiring OneWeb, which is one of the top two constellations of low orbit satellite constellations, which are being established and which are indeed growing in importance as infrastructures. First of all, because they'll cover the entire globe much better than stationary satellites. And for the maritime sector, once it will be possible to go through the poles. That will be very important, that connectivity aspect. And there are also a number of services which will be provided in an improved manner, or which were not necessarily possible with stationary satellites. So that will be great for efficiency. So EUTELSAT is 100% French. We're mainly French. 25% stake BPI. 7% for the participation of French insurers. And then we have infrastructure, pension funds, which own most of our capital. And how about Orange Network? You're part of Orange, yes? Yes. Okay, so sovereignty. Here's my question to the both of you in this respect. Given your company and the functions you hold in your companies, in your opinion, what's the main threat on our sovereignty in your domain? If you'd like to start, I guess I will. Thank you. When we speak of sovereignty, I like to go back to the definition by Lefebvre in the 19th century. He said that sovereignty is the capacity of a state to do what it intends to do without any other constraint than its very own application of its own very law. So when it comes to telecommunications, the world we live in is most definitely hybrid, and that notion of sovereignty or the capacity of a state to be sovereign on all of its own is rather limited. This being said, our business is an infrastructure business. So in order to implement such international telecommunications, and such is our mandate, at any given moment, we need to be able to have the right infrastructure, whether it be subsea cables or satellite fleets, which were built in a spirit of sovereignty, which are not 100% owned by France, because that does not exist, but which in any case allow France to have the means it needs to ensure that its sovereignty is a reality. We have industrial know-how in satellites, as Jean-Hubert was saying, with Airbus and Thales, which are two industrial players in a great position in satellite technologies, or in subsea cables with Alcatel Submarine Networks and Orange. We pretty much have 1/3 of all subsea cables laid amongst the three of us, which is quite good. But the capacity to use such technological bases and knowledge to implement technologies which truly serve national or European sovereignty, well, sometimes we could do better, although, of course, there are a number of innovations or very recent novelties which go in the right direction. For example, Commissioner Breton launched IRIS2, and as part of that project, we're very much hoping that we'll go in the right direction for satellites. There are two main threats, but there are also positive points. Threats, first of all. Are we in a capacity to launch satellites and to operate them? And to do that, you need the entire value chain. And as I said, we have excellent satellite manufacturers. We have EUTELSAT, which is one of the first satellite operators in the world. But I would say perhaps launchers are a weak point. In just 10 years, there have been huge developments with SpaceX, and now they launch more than a dozen. They launch more than 10 times the number of satellites every year compared with Ariane. Ariane 6 will probably provide an answer, but only in part. So we'll have to catch up with SpaceX. That is for the manufacturing part. But once you operate those satellites, you have a cybersecurity threat. And that has definitely been on our agenda lately. There's VUILLEMIN, which is operated by our colleagues in the US, and at the very start of the war in Ukraine, it was pirated by Russia. Because, of course, it was used as a way to communicate with troops on land. So that illustrated how important these resources are and how cybersecurity is important. And the entire industry is working on this. We are working on this to enhance the robustness of satellites. But when it comes to constellations, there's indeed the European initiative with IRIS, which will both provide extra bits of constellations and strengthen existing operators with EUTELSAT and SES, our colleagues and competitors. And here we can say that Europe is on the cutting edge with regards to its capacity to develop rather sovereign infrastructures. Jean-Luc, if I may. I wanted to highlight this again. This is really important for me. There's a huge difference between technological capacities as held by Europe today and the capacity to implement these resources with a certain economic rationale. IRIS2 is a real promise. OneWeb is enhancing EU competitiveness to a certain extent. However, one must recognize that Starlink is the next star on the rise. And in subsea cables, for as solid as our industrial foundations might be, most subsea cables manufactured around the world are the property of your Googles and Amazons, etc. So there are a number of infrastructures which are currently being taken ownership of by our US colleagues. Okay, a question for both of you now. Everyone has the Nord Stream case in mind. And the sabotage operation. Was this a complete shock for you when you learned the news? And did you think that, yes, that can happen to us too? It was not a complete shock. The question of subsea cable security was on our radar, especially with regards to the security of the EU. But it was well known amongst a small circle of military and civil experts. And Nord Stream 1 and 2, as a matter of fact, were sabotaged. And that only allowed for a much wider number of people to be aware of this issue. But I would say that we had tried to sound the alert and the alarm on this topic for a number of years. But the military knew for the longest time that there were Russian spy ships with Yantar were spending a lot of time above Western subsea cables. So people knew of this, but they did not necessarily realize it was a risk. Now people realize this is a risk. Have we acted on this? Not really sure.
Maybe not directly on Nord Stream, but what is very important for sovereignty is resilience of infrastructure. And here also, this is an area where we are rather well positioned in Europe, because precisely we have amongst our geostationary satellites as 36,000 kilometers, you have operators that are fairly powerful and local infrastructure, because you need satellites in space, but you need to land the signal, well, control the satellites themselves from the ground in Europe, and then also control the communication flows that land roughly on the ground with network access, with gateways on the European soil as well. And here you have two operators, ourselves and Suez, that are global leaders. And so you have the geostationary satellite, website layer and Galileo, and so this resilience is very important in sovereignty because that enables us to address quite a few threats if either of those layers was to fail. Jean-Luc is nodding. I think Jean-Hubert is exactly right, as long as he's talking about the satellite ecosystem. The spacecraft ecosystem is resilient by nature. But let me remind you that subsea cables, that's roughly 9 petabits per second of transfer capacity. 1 petabit is a measurement unit that is 1,000 terabits, that are 1,000 gigabits, that are 1,000 megabits themselves. So that's a lot of data. In comparison, compared to a satellite, what is that? The relationship is 200 times the capability of all the satellites that are in the family. So you'll never replace subsea cables by satellites in terms of volume. If 4 or 5 of the main cables connecting France to the US were cut overnight, the internet in Europe would stop. As simple as that. And we would switch over for critical communications. And so suddenly you've dropped the temperature in the room by a few degrees. But then what's the probability that this would happen? Would it be done discreetly? Wouldn't that be an act of war that would give rise to a high-intensity conflict? But this is critical infrastructure that is relatively concentrated. Relatively, there are about 10 subsea cables in the Atlantic, but there are very big ones that have major importance on the way the global internet works, and that is considerable infrastructure. And right now, 80% of internet flows are going to the US. Why? Because almost all of the internet users in France are going to the US to be stored in US data centers. And so the real question in terms of resilience and so on is, why isn't that data stored in Europe? That's another question. I don't know. Countries like Russia solved the problem a long time ago. Russia 5 years ago was in a similar situation to ours, so they voted a simple law. All data about Russian citizens need to be stored in Russia, full stop. Europe or France never wanted to follow that rationale. You focused on the need to have a sort of technological base, and we seem to have it. But there's always a question bothering me. Do we have the right people to operate this technological base, this industry, the skills, the expertise? Are you easily able to find these people? Or is it okay in your industry, or are you facing problems? I would say we can find them. We have a very good educational system. We don't train enough engineers in France, everyone knows that, but we're able to find the people we need. It's about critical mass, being present in several parts of the value chain, so we have a lot of permeability between Thales, EUTELSAT, and so on. Asking about the European dimension now. Of course, in your area, are there European competitors? And regarding also the European institutions, do you think that we need to go further in terms of integration? In space, there's the national returns rule, and also maybe, I don't know what it is in the maritime sector, but if you were the EC Commission, would you think that there's absolutely something important I need to do for you? What would that be? In satellites, Iris squared is really the marker of a change of attitude on the part of the Commission. Rules that used to be widely applicable in Ariane or a program like Airbus, and national returns and return on investment. Also, the management by state agencies and so on. All these principles are completely called into question as part of IRIS squared in order to maximize operational efficiency. So European agencies will tend to take a step back. The private sector will take over. The EC is also taking a step back as well. And there is notion of geographical preference also, or anything like that. So at least in satellites, it seems that the Commission has become aware of the limits of the current model. For subsea cables, it's not present at all. Oh, yeah, okay, yes. Yes, once again. Have you got any idea of the amounts that a single company, Meta, Facebook, has invested in subsea cables in the last 5 years? 10 billion euros. Just them. That's a considerable amount. No private operator in Europe can put so much money on the table. Not even 10% of that. So now there's total economic domination by the GAFAs on international telecommunication systems. In satellites, there is also US domination, but it's less strong. The annual budget for NASA and all agencies is $50 billion. $50 billion. Europe, it's rather 17 billion over 3 years for ESA, the latest ESA budget, the European Space Agency. So yes, indeed, that's quite a ratio. But we need to concentrate our strengths and make sure, and that's the only area of vigilance that we shared with Europe as part of the IRIS program, to make sure that we're not going to spread resources too thin and that we're going to support private operators. It's very important, especially with the constellations we talked about earlier. There will be few objects, 4 or 5 global constellations in the world. SpaceX, us, Amazon will invest. So we're facing big competitors and not many more, maybe a couple more. So it's really important to concentrate resources on these constellations and players. I can see it's already 8 minutes past 6. Nobody really wants to stay beyond the scheduled time. You all seem exhausted, but are there questions from the floor? Otherwise, I've got a lot in store, but I don't want to frustrate you. So is there first a roving microphone? Since we're fully blinded by the lights. Yes. Sir, please stand up. Good afternoon, Aymeric Lotz. I'm a law student at Lille in maritime law. The theme of this roundtable is geostrategic and sovereignty challenges around space and maritime powers. You've defined sovereignty, but I would like to know a definition of maritime power by 2 players that are not too direct naval players. How do you define maritime power, and can that be extended and applied to the EU as a regional bloc? Well, if I can start, I'll answer the question indirectly, I'm sorry. But anyway, we are aware as a satellite operator that we can help maritime player in a major way. CMA CGM bought into EUTELSAT because they saw the opportunity of taking a stake in a growing sector, but it's also a very important sector for them. The ability to operate a fleet of ships and increasingly to be able to use bigger and bigger flows of data that are shared in order to manage this fleet of ships as best they can in order to optimize profitability now and over a very long horizon. That's major for them. And also access to connectivity everywhere, including at the poles, really globally is important for them. Therefore, this ability to support the growth of their fleet and to monitor it seems critical to me. Well, I would answer by looking at the problem from a different angle. You know that the status of the sea has been widely discussed in legal terms. Now, in today's world, there are still 3 shared spaces. There are the poles, the bottom of the sea, and then space. And so we have to observe that these 3 areas are being attacked by some powers and with diverse means. At the poles, it's rather the Russians trying to eat into this territory and taking positions for the future routes that will be offered by this big thaw. On the sea, there is appropriation of the maritime territory. People have gone from utilization to appropriation, and there are few areas where it's so blatant as the China Sea with Chinese actions. And in space, I personally consider that the massive deployment of constellations by a player like Starlink is also a sort of land grab, because with satellites, once you're installed, all others need to keep a certain distance to respect your operations. And so a maritime or a space power is someone which, in spite of very powerful players, can withstand this land grab rationale and deploy their own resources to defend their sovereignty. But that's my definition. If I can come back to what Jean-Luc was saying, there's a parallel between the sea and space, because in fact there are a lot of areas that are the property of all states, or rather that are not the property of any state, and that's why regulations are important. In space, it is critical, as you can imagine. Orbital resources, the spectrum, these are so many shared resources that are governed by the ITU, a rule that has existed for a long time, that explains the strong cooperation around the ISS. The reason it exists is because space belongs to everybody. And power is also the ability to guide regulations. In space, France is one of the countries. The French space law is the most up-to-date, and it really tries to have it adopted by a lot of countries. So this ability to regulate or have laws imposed to everybody is a major aspect. And in the maritime domain, it's something that France is able to do. I can't see any other. Oh, yes. I don't know whether there's a microphone. Madam. Good afternoon. I'm Bushra Jogut. I'm a student at Paris 1 University, and I'm also on a work-study program at Garex. You talked about the impact of a cyber attack against a satellite by the Russians at the beginning of the Ukraine war. I wanted to know whether subsea cables were also impacted by cyber attacks, and if so, was there cyber insurance that was offered to protect subsea cables? Well, as far as I know, in modern times, there was no cyber attack on subsea cables. Personally, I consider that the risk of cyber attack on subsea cables is fairly low, because these are systems that are fairly isolated and that offer an attack surface that's fairly small. The real risk for subsea cables is a physical attack, having them cut or tearing them off, and this is something that can be done very easily. You don't need a cyber attack to neutralize a subsea cable. Just an inflatable with a good anchor will do the trick, and it's much less costly. And as far as I know, there is no insurance for subsea cables for that type of risk. While I can imagine that one of the easiest areas to attack is the land infrastructure. Well, the easiest place to attack a subsea cable is still land, yes, when it makes landfall. So you may wonder about the relevance of capturing data in the middle of the sea, which is technically very difficult, whereas once the cable reaches land, well, it follows your favorite B road under a few centimeters of concrete. And last question, I can see it's 6:15, but I don't want to deprive anyone of their opportunity. No, no one. So I'll turn to the mistress of ceremonies, Cécile, who'll give me the final gong for the day. Yes, if you are finished, I'll let everyone go so that you can announce the rest of the festivities. Yes, a few housekeeping points. A phone was found, so if you really, it was found. Okay, perfect. You are expected at 7 at the Cercle de l'Union Interalliée. There's a dress code. If you have any doubts, Pascal is here to answer your questions. And do take your name tag with you. Gentlemen will have to put their ties back on. That's the rule there. Jacket and tie. And don't forget your name tag. And I'll be back with you at 9 tomorrow. Enjoy your evening and see you tomorrow.